One marvel of a day, he had walked so far that when he returned the moon was high and full and all the world was purple shadow and silver. The stillness of the lake and shore and wood was so wonderful that he did not go into the villa he had lived. He walked down to the little bowered terrace at the water's edge and sat upon a seat and breathed in all the heavenly scents of the night. He felt the strange calmness stealing over him, and he knew it grew deeper and deeper until he fell asleep. He did not know when he fell asleep when he began to dream. His dream was so real that he did not feel as if he were dreaming. He remembered afterward how intensely wide awake and alert he thought he was. He thought that as he sat and breathed in the scent of the late roses and listened to the lapping of the water at his feet, he heard a voice calling. It was a sweet and clear and happy and far away voice. It seemed very far, but he heard it as distinctly as if it had been at his very side. "Archie! Archie! Archie!" it said, and then again, sweeter and clearer than before, "Archie! Archie!" He thought he sprang to his feet, not even startled. It was such a real voice, and it seemed so natural that he should hear it. "Lilias! Lilias!" he answered. "Lilias, where are you?" "In the garden." It came back like a sound from a golden flute. "In the garden." And then the dream ended. But he did not awaken. He slept soundly and sweetly all through the lovely night. When he did awake at last, it was a brilliant morning, and a servant was staring at him. He was an Italian servant and was accustomed, as all the servants of the villa were, to accepting without question any strange thing his foreign master might do. No one ever knew when he would go out or come in, or where he would choose to sleep, or where he would roam, or lie in the boat on the lake all night. The man held a platter with some letters on it, and he waited quietly until Mr. Craven took him. The man held a salver with some letters on it, and he waited quietly until Mr. Craven took them. When he had gone away, Mr. Craven sat a few moments, holding them in his hand and looking at the lake. His strange calm was still upon him, and something more, a lightness, as if the cruel thing which had been done had not happened as he thought, as if something had changed. He was remembering the dream, the real dream. "In the garden," he said, wondering at himself. "In the garden. But the door is locked and the key is buried deep." When he glanced at the letters a few minutes later, he saw that one lying at the top of the rest was an English letter and came from Yorkshire. It was directed in a plain woman's hand, but it was not a hand he knew. He opened it, scarcely thinking of the writer, but the first words attracted his attention at once. "Dear Sir, I am Susan Sowerby, that made bold to speak to you at once on the moor. It was about Miss Mary I spoke. I will make bold to speak again. Please, sir, I would come home if I was you. I think you would be glad to come. And if you will excuse me, sir, I think your lady would ask you to come if she was here. Your obedient servant, Susan Sowerby." Mr. Craven read the letter twice before he put it back in his envelope. He kept thinking about the dream. "I will go to Misselthwaite," he said. "Yes, I will go at once." And he went through the garden to the villa and ordered Pitcher to prepare for his return to England. In a few days he was in Yorkshire again. And on the long railroad journey he found himself thinking of his boy as he had never thought in all the 10 years past. During those years he only wished to forget him. Now, though he did not intend to think about him, memories of him constantly drifted into his mind. He remembered the black days when he had raved like a madman because the child was alive and the mother was dead. He had refused to see it, and when he had gone to look at it at last, it had been such a weak, wretched thing that everyone had been sure it would die in a few days. But to the surprise of those who took care of it, the days passed and it lived. And then everyone believed it would be a deformed and crippled creature. He had not meant to be a bad father, but he had not felt like a father at all. He had supplied doctors and nurses and luxuries, but he had shrunk from the mere thought of the boy and had buried himself in his own misery. The first time after a year's absence, he returned to Misselthwaite, and the small miserable thing looked languidly and indifferently, and he lifted his face to the great gray eyes with black lashes round them, so like and yet so horribly unlike the happy eyes he had adored. He could not bear the sight of them, and he turned away pale as death. After that he scarcely ever saw him, except when he was asleep. And all he knew of him was that he was a confirmed invalid with a vicious, hysterical, half-insane temper. He could only be kept from furies dangerous to himself by being given his own way in every detail. All this was not an uplifting thing to recall, but as the train whirled him through mountain passes and golden plains, the man who was coming alive began to think in a new way, and he thought long and steadily and deeply. "Perhaps I have been wrong all for 10 years, he said to himself. 10 years is a long time. It may be too late to do anything. Quite too late. What have I been thinking of? Of course, this was the wrong magic. To begin by saying too late. Even Colin would have told him that. But he knew nothing of magic, either black or white. This he had yet to learn. He wondered if Susan Sowerby had taken courage and written to him only because the motherly creature had realized that the boy was much worse, was fatally ill. If he had not been under a spell of the curious calmness which had possession of him, he would have been more wretched than ever. But the calm had been brought a sort of courage and hope with it. Instead of giving way to thoughts of the worst, he actually found he was trying to believe in better things. Could it be possible that she sees that I may be able to do him good and control him? He thought. I will go and see her on my way to Misselthwaite. But when on his way across the moor, he stopped the carriage at the cottage. 7 or 8 children who were playing about gathered in a group and bobbing 7 or 8 friendly and polite curtsies told him that their mother had gone to the other side of the moor early in the morning to help a woman who had a new baby. Aw, Dickon, they volunteered, was over at the manor working in one of the gardens where he went several days each week. Mr. Craven looked over the collection of sturdy little bodies and round, red-cheeked faces, each one grinning in its own particular way, and he awoke to the fact that they were a healthy, likable lot. He smiled at their friendly grins and took a golden sovereign from his pocket and gave it to our Elizabeth Ellen, who was the oldest. If you divide that into 8 parts, there will be half a crown for each of you, he said. Then amid grins and chuckles and bobbings of curtsies, he drove away, leaving ecstasy and nudging elbows and little jumps of joy behind. The drive across the wonderfulness of the moor was a soothing thing. Why did it seem to give him a sense of homecoming which he had been sure he could never feel again? The sense of beauty of land and sky and purple bloom of distance, and a warming of the heart and drawing nearer to the great old house which held those of his blood for 600 years. How had he driven away from it the last time, shuddering to think of its closed rooms, and the boy living in the 4-poster bed with the brocade hangings? Was it perhaps that he might find himself changed a little for the better, and that he might overcome his shrinking from him? How that dream had been, how wonderful in the clear voice which called back to him, "In the garden, in the garden." "I will try to find the key," he said. "I will try to open the door. I must, though I don't know why." When he arrived at the manor, the servants who received him with the usual ceremony noticed that he looked better, and that he did not go to the remote rooms where he usually lived, attended by Pritchard. He went to the library and sent for Mrs. Medlock. "To tell the truth, sir, Master Colin might be better, and he might be changing for the worse. His appetite, sir, is past understanding, and his ways—" "Has he become more peculiar?" her master asked, knitting his brows anxiously. "That's it, sir. He's growing very peculiar when you compare him to what he used to be. He used to eat nothing and then suddenly began eating something enormous, and then he stopped again all at once and the meals were sent just as they used to be. You never knew, sir, perhaps, that out of doors he would never let himself be taken. The things we've gone through to get him out of his chair and leave a body trembling like a leaf. He'd throw himself into such a state that Dr. Craven said he couldn't be responsible for forcing him. Well, sir, just without warning, not long after his worst tantrum, he suddenly insisted on being taken out every day by Miss Mary and Susan Sowerby's boy Dickon that could push his chair. He took a fancy to both Miss Mary and Dickon brought his tame animals, and if you'll credit it, sir, out of doors he will stay until morning and night." "How does he look?" was the next question. "If he took his food natural, sir, you'd think he'd be putting on flesh, but we're afraid that he might be sort of a bloat. He sometimes laughs in a strange way when he's alone with Miss Mary. He never used to laugh at all. Dr. Craven is coming to see you at once if you'll allow him. He was never as puzzled in all his life." "Where is Master Colin now?" Mr. Craven asked. "In the garden, sir. He's always in the garden, though not a human creature is allowed to go near for fear they'll look at him." Mr. Craven scarcely heard her last words. "In the garden," he said, and after he had sent Medlock away, he stood and repeated it again and again. "In the garden."